Question for you. Do you have those passages in the Bible that maybe you're really familiar with, you've read them over and over, and yet somehow you still land on the same questions every time? I have one of those spots. Every year at the beginning of the year, I go back and I start reading the Bible through chronologically. So now we are in March, almost a quarter of the way through, and yet I am not a quarter of the way through my Bible because I get stuck on this one passage. And I do it almost every year, but I think God showed me something this year and I'm really grateful for it. So I want to talk to you about it. Now, before we get to the book of Exodus, we got to do a little bit of setup. Exodus is called Exodus because it is the exit of the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. But the Israelites weren't always slaves in Egypt, right? Eventually, after creation and after the flood and after Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, we get to Joseph. And that's where we end the book of Genesis. Joseph rises to power in Egypt and he's like second in command and everything is going really great for him. And by default, good for the Israelites. But then there's another Pharaoh that comes to power and he knows nothing of Joseph and he knows nothing of anything that has been done before. If he does know historically, it doesn't mean anything to him. It's not influencing his decisions. And all he sees is that the Israelites have risen in number and growing in power and they're getting to the point where they could overpower the Egyptians and this is not okay. So now they are slaves to the Egyptians. And this is where we find ourselves with the story of Moses. And we know the Red Sea. We know the big miracle moments. We know Moses going to Pharaoh, let my people go. But there's this part that has always bothered me. See, this wasn't Moses's idea. He didn't set out to go for a walk one night and encounter a burning bush that would tell him to go back and do all of this stuff. He had actually left, he'd fled Egypt because of a whole thing, and we don't have time to get into it, but it's a great story. But he was not looking to go back to this place. In fact, his life was in danger if he went back. Then God appears to him in this burning bush and tells him, go do this. It wasn't on Moses's radar. And so when God tells you to do something and you cooperate, you eventually do, go and you're ready. Okay, Lord, here we go. I'm doing it. I'm doing it with you. You're the one that said this. Let's do it. You expect that there'd be a certain amount of favor with that, right? Like, okay, doors are going to open. So when God tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go, you would think that Pharaoh would be like, okay, I'm going to, because God would make it happen that way. But that isn't what happens. Instead, in the book of Exodus, we see God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So instead of like a quick exchange here, we end up with plague after plague. We got gnats, we got flies, we got locusts, we got blood in the water. We've got, did I say frogs? That creeps me out. There's a lot of bugs. There's a lot of organisms that are sent in the form of plagues. And then you have the death of the firstborn that we deal with. So this is like, it should have been an easy thing, we would think, but it's totally not an easy thing. I don't understand why, if God says go do this, why all of a sudden is Pharaoh's heart hardened, until I saw this verse, Exodus chapter 7, verse 3. And this might be like, you're probably going, yeah, I've known this forever. But this was like huge to me. So I just want to read this to you. Exodus chapter 7, verse 3. This is God talking. I will make Pharaoh's heart stubborn so I can multiply my miraculous signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. I will make Pharaoh's heart stubborn so that I can multiply my miraculous signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. There's a reason. There's a reason for the delay. There's always a reason for the delay. There's our understanding and our flesh that would say it should be this and it should be that. God said, do it. Now we just got to go do it. And it should be great because God said it. I will harden Pharaoh's heart. I will make his heart stubborn, says the Lord, so that I can multiply my miraculous signs and wonders. There's a reason for this. Somehow, I'm not sure that understanding made it easy to endure frogs everywhere, or locusts everywhere, or flies and gnats, which are not the same thing, not the same plague, two totally different plagues. What do you do when the drinking water has become blood? And that's what you're enduring. Also, that God can multiply his miraculous signs and wonders. We may not understand, and the lingering time that it takes doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us, but there is always a reason. Now, let's think this all the way through. It had been many generations since Joseph. It had been a while. We have a whole new crop of people here. That means the Israelites aren't super familiar with some of the miracles that are going on or that had gone on in past history. Maybe they knew them historically, but they'd not encountered them. But let's fast forward to what's going to happen. See, they didn't know what was on the other side of their freedom, but God did. They didn't know that they would encounter a Red Sea, but God did. They didn't know that they would encounter a wilderness with limited food, and this journey that should have taken a handful of days is now taking 40 years. They didn't know that that's what was going to come on the other side of their freedom, but God did. He knew how hard the road ahead was going to be. He knew that he had a land prepared for them. There was a promised land. He knew that. But they didn't know everything they'd have to walk through to get there. Only God knew those things. So the idea of God's miraculous signs and wonders being multiplied right before he sets the Israelites free, of course he would do that. This delay was not meant to frustrate them. This delay was meant to reveal the goodness of God, because when you've seen all of the things that God does, when you've seen his power put on display, and then you come up against a Red Sea and you're going, I don't know, how are we going to do this? How are we going to get out of this? You've got something fresh in your mind, not from generations past, but something fresh in your mind. Now, I saw frogs everywhere. I saw the Nile River red as blood. I saw this happen. I saw this happen. I saw this happen. I'm pretty sure we're dealing with a God that could do this, because the Lord doesn't need this massive amount of faith to erupt. He needs a mustard seed. And being able to look back and see signs and wonders being multiplied with every moment that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, that very well could have been the fuel that they needed for the mustard seed, that God did not do all of that just to leave them standing on the shores of the Red Sea, trapped, hindered from whatever direction they could go. He just needed them to have that much, for one person to have that much to believe, no, God can do this. When they're in the wilderness, that much faith, no, God can do this. Now, did it always work that way? No, they were a complaining bunch of people. But there was one. There was Moses that had the faith because he had seen everything that God had done. It was Moses' staff that turned into a serpent before any of this even started. So the delay, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, was for the multiplication of miracles, for the multiplication of signs and wonders. It was not to frustrate them. It was not to confuse them. And it's not to frustrate us or to confuse us now. But what if this delay is meant to reveal the goodness of God, the compassion of God? He knows it's hard, and he knows it's frustrating, and he knows how we feel, and he knows that it can feel hopeless and we can live in a place of despair more often than we'd like to admit. But even in that, there's the opportunity to reveal his goodness. He hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he could put his power on display. So what felt like a delay to them was an opportunity to see the power of God move in ways they wouldn't otherwise have encountered. May the same thing be true for us.